The autumn rain fell in thick, relentless sheets across the interstate as Sarah Mitchell navigated her silver Civic through the evening traffic. It was a Tuesday, exactly 5:47 p.m. according to the dashboard clock, a time that would later be marked in police reports and hospital records as the moment everything changed. Sarah had spent the afternoon at her mother's house in the suburbs, approximately 15 miles outside the city center. It was a routine visit, something she did every other Tuesday without fail. Her mother had insisted on making Sarah's favorite meal, homemade lasagna and garlic bread, and they'd spent hours talking about Sarah's job at Lincoln High School, where she taught advanced placement English literature. Had also doted on her granddaughter, Emma, reading her bedtime stories even though it was only 4 in the afternoon, and Emma wouldn't sleep for hours yet. Emma sat in her car seat behind Sarah's driver's seat, positioned precisely as the safety guidelines recommended. At 3 years and 2 months old, Emma was an exceptionally bright child, curious about everything and possessed of a vocabulary that amazed her grandmother. She was dressed in her favorite outfit, a soft purple dress with white socks that had little ducks embroidered on them, and wore a small yellow bow in her curly hair, so much like her mother's had been before Sarah had cut it short for practicality. Emma clutched her stuffed bunny, Mr. Wiggles, against her chest, a worn toy that had traveled everywhere with her since her 2nd birthday. The bunny had been a gift from Emma's father, David, before he'd left 2 years ago to pursue a job opportunity in Colorado. He'd promised to stay in Emma's life, but promises had a way of fading with distance, and Sarah had learned not to expect much from him anymore. Sarah had checked the weather before leaving her mother's house and had decided it was still safe to drive home. The rain had been falling for only an hour, and while it was heavy, the roads were still relatively clear. She knew this route by heart. She'd driven it hundreds of times over the past 3 years since Emma was born. From her mother's house on Drive, she would take surface streets to reach the interstate, then merge onto Route 95 heading north toward the city. From there, it was a straight shot to her neighborhood in the Riverside district, approximately 20 minutes depending on traffic. Tonight, traffic seemed lighter than usual, perhaps because of the rain. Many people had probably left work earlier or decided to stay late at the office rather than venture out into the wet evening. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel firmly, her fingers positioned at 10 and 2 o'clock, exactly as she'd been taught in driving school years ago. She was naturally cautious, some would say overly cautious, when it came to driving, especially with Emma in the car. She had installed the most expensive car seat available, had taken a defensive driving course specifically to improve her skills, and never exceeded the speed limit by more than 5 miles per hour. Her friends often joked that she drove like a 70-year-old woman, and Sarah didn't mind the teasing. Safety was paramount when you were responsible for a child's life. Emma sang softly from the back seat, a song she'd learned at preschool, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are." Her voice was sweet and slightly off-key, the voice of a child who hadn't yet learned to be self-conscious about her singing. Sarah's heart swelled with love as she listened. These small moments, driving home with her daughter singing beside her, the warmth of the car against the cold rain outside, the domestic ordinariness of it all, were the moments Sarah lived for. Her job was demanding, her life was complicated, and money was often tight on a teacher's salary, but these moments made everything worthwhile. The radio was tuned to a light jazz station, and a smooth saxophone melody filled the spaces between Emma's singing. Sarah was thinking about dinner plans. She had ground beef in the freezer, and she could make tacos, Emma's favorite. She was also mentally preparing for the stack of essay papers waiting on her dining room table. Her AP literature class had just finished reading The Great Gatsby, and she had 30 essays to grade. It was a task she'd been dreading, but she'd promised herself she'd finish at least half of them before bed. The intersection of 5th and Main Street was visible in the distance. Sarah could see the traffic light was green in her direction, and she maintained her steady speed of 45 miles per hour, exactly the posted limit for this stretch of road. The interstate merged into surface streets here, and traffic typically funneled through this major intersection. Sarah had passed through it thousands of times in her life. She'd crossed this very intersection as a teenager, as a young adult, as a pregnant woman. It was unremarkable, ordinary, utterly routine. Behind Sarah, approximately half a mile back on the same road, a massive commercial delivery truck labored through the rain. The truck was a freightliner, white with blue lettering that read Superior Logistics painted across its side. Inside the cab, the driver was running behind schedule. He'd been stuck in traffic on the interstate and was anxious about making his final delivery of the day before his shift ended. The truck was loaded with electronic equipment bound for a distribution center across town. Had been driving for Superior Logistics for 7 years and had an otherwise clean safety record, though he was known among his peers for pushing the speed limit and driving aggressively in heavy traffic. Had noticed the brakes feeling slightly soft that morning, but he'd chalked it up to the rain. He'd serviced the truck 3 weeks ago, or at least the paperwork said he had. In reality, had taken his truck to a cut-rate garage that specialized in quick maintenance jobs, not rigorous inspections. The brake fluid level had been low, and the pads were worn, but the mechanic had assured him everything was fine. Hadn't questioned it. Now, as he approached the intersection of 5th and Main, traveling at approximately 60 miles per hour, he glanced down at the speedometer and made a mental note to slow down a bit. But when pressed his foot on the brake pedal, nothing happened. Or rather, the truck slowed minimally, the brakes providing far less resistance than they should have. Pressed harder, his foot going nearly to the floor. Still, the truck only gradually decelerated. Panic flooded through him as he realized the terrible truth. His brakes were failing catastrophically. He had seconds to react. The traffic light ahead was turning red, and Sarah's Silver was directly in his path, just 50 yards away. In those final moments before impact, saw the car clearly. He could even make out the silhouette of a small child in the back seat. He knew, with absolute certainty, what was about to happen, and he was powerless to stop it. Sarah never saw the truck coming. The collision lasted less than 2 seconds, but it felt like an eternity to everyone involved. The impact was catastrophic, a violent meeting of machine and physics that the mind's ability to comprehend such sudden, brutal force. The front of 60,000-pound truck struck the driver's side of Sarah's Civic at approximately 57 miles per hour. The smaller vehicle crumpled instantly, its metal frame no match for the massive weight and momentum behind the commercial vehicle. Sarah's body was thrown forward and sideways simultaneously, her catching just enough to prevent her from being ejected through the windshield, but not enough to prevent devastating internal injuries. Her left arm shattered at the wrist and upper arm. 3 of her ribs fractured, and 1 punctured her left lung. Her spleen ruptured, bleeding profusely into her abdominal cavity. She lost consciousness within seconds, her mind merciful in its retreat from the agony her body was experiencing. In the back seat, Emma's scream pierced through the chaos, a primal, terrified wail that would echo in the nightmares of emergency responders for months to come. The impact threw her small body violently to one side, but her car seat, securely fastened and expensive, did its job. It held her in place, protecting her from the worst of the impact. Emma was physically unharmed, but psychologically the trauma was shattering. She watched her mother go limp. She heard the terrible sounds of metal tearing and glass shattering. She felt the violent jolt and the sudden wrongness of everything, and she screamed and screamed and screamed. 14 minutes later, emergency responders arrived at the scene. Firefighters had to use the jaws of life to pry open the damaged driver's door. Paramedics worked frantically to stabilize Sarah, who was barely breathing and had lost so much blood that her skin had taken on a ghastly gray pallor. Her blood pressure was dropping dangerously. Her pulse was thready and weak. The paramedics knew they were racing against death itself. Sarah was airlifted by helicopter to Metropolitan Hospital's Trauma Center, the best-equipped facility in the region for severe injury cases. Emma, physically untouched but emotionally devastated, was transported by ambulance to the same hospital for observation and psychological evaluation. Had managed to bring his truck to a halt on the far side of the intersection. He was conscious, shaken, but physically unharmed. He emerged from his cab with his hands raised, already knowing he was in serious trouble. Police officers on scene conducted field sobriety tests, all of which he passed. He submitted to a breathalyzer test, which was negative. There was no indication of drug use. Claimed immediately and repeatedly that his brakes had failed. He pointed to his truck's brake system, showing officers the evidence. The brake fluid was nearly empty, the brake pads were worn down to the metal backing, and the master cylinder showed signs of significant leakage. For the first 48 hours, everything seemed straightforward. The preliminary police investigation appeared to support claims. The truck's mechanical inspection revealed clear evidence of brake failure. Eyewitness accounts at the scene corroborated the sequence of events. Multiple witnesses that had been traveling at a normal speed before attempting to brake. Several said they heard the distinctive sound of a truck engine downshifting frantically as the driver attempted to slow the vehicle. The narrative seemed clear: mechanical failure, not human negligence. Sarah was the victim, was an unlucky driver whose truck had failed him catastrophically. But then Superior Logistics, the company that owned the truck, retained a team of high-powered defense lawyers from the prestigious firm Mitchell, Caldwell and Associates. These weren't ordinary attorneys. They specialized in defending corporate clients against personal injury lawsuits, and they were frighteningly effective. Their hourly billing rates exceeded $500. They had investigators on staff, expert witnesses on retainer, and relationships with judges and insurance companies that spanned decades. Their lead attorney, Richard Caldwell himself, was a former prosecutor with connections throughout the legal system. Within 3 days of the accident, the narrative began to shift. Caldwell's team launched what could only be described as a smear campaign. They hired accident reconstruction experts, not the independent ones the police had already consulted, but experts known for producing reports favorable to whichever side paid them. These experts produced a technical analysis, claiming that Sarah's vehicle had been traveling at approximately 65 miles per hour at the time of impact, well above the posted speed limit of 45. They claimed her excessive speed was the primary cause of the accident, not the truck's brake failure. How did they reach this conclusion? Through complex mathematical models and analysis of the accident scene that made generous assumptions in their favor. The damage patterns to both vehicles were analyzed, but the experts selectively highlighted data that supported their narrative while downplaying evidence that contradicted it. The police's accident reconstruction expert had concluded the speeds were much lower, but Caldwell's team simply disagreed, loudly and publicly. Next, Caldwell's investigators went after Sarah's driving history. They obtained police records showing 3 speeding tickets in the past 5 years, all relatively minor infractions that had been resolved. But in Caldwell's presentation, they became evidence of a pattern of reckless driving. They interviewed Sarah's neighbors and colleagues, fishing for any comments suggesting she was careless or negligent. They discovered that Sarah's mother had once mentioned in passing that Sarah drove a bit fast sometimes, and they used this anecdote to paint her as a speed-obsessed driver. The came when Caldwell's team produced maintenance records for the truck. The records, conveniently signed and dated, showed that the truck's brakes had been serviced just 12 days before the accident. According to these records, the brakes had been thoroughly inspected and determined to be in perfect working order. The record was marked with an impressive-looking company stamp and seal, making it appear entirely legitimate. In reality, it was a fabrication. The garage that had actually serviced the truck, a cut-rate operation that didn't keep meticulous records, had been contacted by Caldwell's investigators and offered a generous sum to clarify the service records. The garage owner, a man named Tommy who was struggling financially, accepted the offer and signed the fraudulent document. The insurance companies, sensing a shifting wind, began withdrawing their initial support for Sarah. The narrative in the media started to change. Instead of headlines reading, "Mechanical failure causes massive collision," new stories emerged. "Driver blamed in truck accident. Speed may have caused intersection crash." Investigation raises questions about responsibility. Meanwhile, Sarah lay in a medically induced coma in the ICU at Metropolitan Hospital. She had 3 emergency surgeries. Her left lung had been re-expanded. Her spleen had been removed. Her broken arm had been set with plates and screws. She was on a ventilator, her survival uncertain from day to day. The hospital bills were accumulating at an alarming rate. Sarah's health insurance would cover some of it, but not everything. She had no disability insurance through her teaching job. The mortgage on her modest house and the car payment on her were still due every month. And Emma, her precious 3-year-old daughter, sat in her hospital room down the hall, attended by her grandmother. Emma had stopped speaking. She would sit silently, clutching her stuffed bunny Mr. Wiggles, her eyes staring at nothing. Occasionally, she would flinch at sudden sounds. The hospital's child psychologist diagnosed her with acute stress disorder and trauma. The doctor prescribed mild sedatives to help her sleep. Mitchell held her granddaughter at night and wept, terrified that Sarah would die and that Emma would be left to process this horror alone. Nobody yet understood the full scope of the conspiracy being orchestrated against them. Nobody knew that the maintenance records were forged, that the expert witnesses were biased, that an entire corporate machine was being deployed to shift blame from the truck company to the woman lying unconscious in a hospital bed. Sarah and Emma had become casualties not of an accident, but of a system that could be manipulated, purchased, and weaponized by those with enough money and ruthlessness to do so. The real battle was only just beginning. 6 months had passed since the accident. Sarah had been released from the hospital 3 months earlier, though released was perhaps a generous term. She'd been discharged because her acute medical crisis had stabilized enough that continued hospitalization wasn't necessary, not because she was well. Her left arm remained in a brace, and physical therapy left her in excruciating pain. She suffered from chronic shortness of breath due to the damage to her lung. She experienced frequent dizzy spells and migraines. She had been approved for a temporary leave of absence from teaching, though her school district had made it clear that her position was not guaranteed upon her return. The medical debt had ballooned to over $340,000. Her insurance had covered approximately 60% of her hospital bills, but the remainder, combined with lost wages during her recovery, had devastated her finances. She'd taken out a second mortgage on her house and had maxed out her credit cards just to cover living expenses and legal fees. Now, on a cold November morning, Sarah stood before judge in criminal court, room 7B, facing charges of reckless endangerment and criminal negligence causing serious bodily injury. The penalty for conviction on both charges was up to 7 years in state prison. Sarah wore a navy blue dress that hung loosely on her frame. She'd lost 23 pounds since the accident due to stress and medication side effects. Her hair, once vibrant, had dulled and had been pulled back into a severe bun. Dark circles beneath her eyes to months of sleepless nights filled with anxiety and dread. Her public defender, Johnson, sat beside her at the defense table. He was a competent man, dedicated to his work, but he was overwhelmed. He carried a caseload of 187 active cases. He had minimal resources to hire expert witnesses or investigators. He'd done his best to prepare a defense, but he was fighting an uphill battle against an opponent with unlimited funds. Richard Caldwell sat at the prosecution table. Technically, the case was being prosecuted by the district attorney's office, but Caldwell was there as a representative of the civil interests, and his presence was unmistakable. With him were 2 associate attorneys, both sharp and aggressive, and a team of expert witnesses who'd been carefully selected for their ability to present complex technical information in ways that made Sarah look guilty. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They began with emotional impact, calling Officer Daniel Torres, the first police officer to arrive at the accident scene. Torres described Sarah's vehicle, crumpled and destroyed. He about finding Emma screaming in the back seat, about the fear in her small voice, about the blood visible in Sarah's vehicle. The jurors listened intently, their faces growing darker as the horror of the scene was painted for them. Torres was followed by the paramedics who transported Sarah to the hospital. They described her injuries in graphic detail, the ruptured organs, the broken bones, the massive blood loss. One paramedic that they genuinely believed Sarah was going to die in the ambulance. He spoke about the difficulty of trying to save her life, while Emma's screams echoed from the back of the ambulance in the hands of a second paramedic. Then came the expert witnesses. Doctor was a biomechanics engineer with 30 years of experience in accident reconstruction. He had in over 400 legal cases. His CV was impressive, his credentials impeccable. Caldwell's team had paid him $15,000 for this case, money he earned by testifying to their narrative. Doctor presented complex mathematical models and three-dimensional simulations showing the accident from multiple angles. He used technical terminology that most jurors barely understood: coefficient of friction, vector analysis, deceleration rates, momentum transfer. His conclusion, stated with absolute confidence, was that Sarah's vehicle had been traveling at approximately 62 miles per hour at the time of impact, significantly above the 45 miles per hour speed limit. How had he reached this conclusion? Through accident reconstruction analysis that involved assumptions, calculations, and interpretations of evidence. When Johnson cross-examined him, attempting to raise questions about the assumptions he'd made, Doctor simply repeated his testimony in slightly different words. He remained unshaken, confident, authoritative. The jury seemed to accept his analysis. Next came Officer James Mitchell, a traffic accident investigator with the police department. Mitchell had been called by the prosecution because Caldwell's team had gotten to him first. Mitchell that, while the initial investigation had suggested brake failure, a more thorough analysis now indicated that Sarah's speed was the primary contributing factor. He presented the truck's maintenance records, the fraudulent ones, showing that the brakes had been serviced. Mitchell appeared uncomfortable during his testimony, avoiding eye contact with Sarah. He knew something was off about these records, but he'd been persuaded by Caldwell's team that he might have misunderstood the initial findings. As the prosecution's case continued, Sarah felt her hope diminishing day by day. She sat in the courtroom, her arm still in its brace, watching her reputation being systematically destroyed. The local news stations provided extensive coverage. One reporter, an aggressive man named from Channel 7 News, began his evening broadcasts with innuendo about Sarah's fitness as a mother. Was the driver distracted by her young passenger? He suggested without evidence. Was she reckless with her daughter's life? Another news outlet published a piece titled "Speed Demon Mother," how a teacher's recklessness almost killed her own child. Someone, Sarah never found out who, had leaked photographs from the accident scene to the media. Local news stations showed images of her crushed vehicle while discussing the tragedy. Sarah's social media accounts were flooded with messages. Some were supportive, but many were viciously cruel. People she'd known for years posted comments suggesting she deserved whatever consequences came to her. Her colleagues at school maintained a distance, some out of uncertainty about her guilt, others afraid their association with her might damage their own reputations. Emma suffered most from the negative publicity. At preschool, other children had picked up on their parents' judgmental attitudes and had begun excluding her. Teachers reported that Emma seemed withdrawn and anxious. She'd regressed in her speech, speaking less than she had before. She would cling to her grandmother with desperate intensity, terrified that something terrible would happen next. The child psychologist reported that Emma was developing symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder. Emma had nightmares almost every night. She'd wake up screaming, calling for her mother. When Sarah tried to comfort her, Emma would flinch, as if afraid that her mother herself was dangerous. Sarah's mother was aging under the stress. She'd been Sarah's primary support system, caring for Emma during court proceedings and medical appointments, had taken a leave of absence from her job as a librarian. She was running on anxiety and coffee, her face becoming more haggard with each passing day. She'd begun having blood pressure problems, and her doctor warned her that the stress could lead to a heart attack or stroke. As the trial stretched into its fourth week, the defense's case felt pathetically inadequate by comparison. Johnson called a few character witnesses: Sarah's mother, a colleague from school, Sarah's former supervisor from her previous job, who to her responsibility and care as a mother and teacher. But these testimonials were no match for the technical expertise and professional presentation of the prosecution's case. Johnson also called his own accident reconstruction expert, Dr., who challenged doctors' analysis and suggested that brake failure was a more likely explanation for the accident. But's presentation was less polished, less confident. She lacked stage presence. More importantly, she'd been paid significantly less than his office could afford, only $3,000 for her testimony, while Caldwell's team had invested $15,000 in. The disparity in resources was evident in the quality and confidence of the expert testimony. As closing arguments approached, Sarah felt as though she were drowning. Judge's face revealed nothing, but she seemed bound by the legal requirement to consider the evidence as presented. The judge's sympathetic expression couldn't override the legal burden of proof. The jury seemed increasingly skeptical of the defense's narrative. Sarah's lawyer had done his best, but his best was simply insufficient against the crushing weight of money, power, and professional expertise arrayed against them. The verdict seemed inevitable. Sarah was going to prison, and Emma would grow up visiting her mother behind glass. It was 3 a.m. when Johnson sat alone in his cramped office on the 4th floor of the Riverside Public Defender building. Empty coffee cups were scattered across his desk, some with moldy remnants of coffee from days past. Files were stacked haphazardly on every available surface. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, creating a constant background noise that had become white noise over the years. He'd been working as a public defender for 18 years, and he'd learned to function on minimal sleep and maximum stress. But he'd never felt more defeated than he did right now. The Sarah Mitchell trial was destroying him. He knew she was innocent. He could feel it in his bones, the way experienced trial lawyers often could. The evidence of her guilt was circumstantial and manipulated. The truck's brake failure was obvious to anyone who wanted to see it, but the jury wasn't seeing it. The jury was hearing the polished testimony of expert witnesses and accepting it at face value. The jury was absorbing the media narrative of a reckless mother. The jury was predisposed to believe guilt, because the prosecution had presented their case with such professional competence. Had tried everything he knew how to do. He challenged the expert testimony, pointing out the assumptions and interpretations embedded in doctors' analysis. He'd cross-examined Officer Mitchell, attempting to establish that the brake failure was the primary cause of the accident. He'd presented character evidence to suggest that Sarah was a responsible, careful person. He'd brought in his own expert witness. But against the crushing weight of superior logistics legal resources, it all felt like throwing pebbles at an avalanche. The jury would render their verdict within days. The prosecution was confident. Judge had indicated that closing arguments would begin in the morning, and the jury would likely receive their instructions by afternoon. By tomorrow evening, Sarah's fate might be sealed. She would be convicted. She would go to prison. Emma would grow up with a mother behind bars, visiting her through glass, their conversations monitored by corrections officers. Was close to despair. He'd been a public defender because he believed in justice, because he believed that everyone deserved a vigorous defense regardless of their ability to pay. But cases like this one tested that faith. How could justice prevail when one side had unlimited resources and the other had almost none? How could truth triumph when it was so effectively buried beneath layers of professional testimony and expert manipulation? He was about to leave his office, finally go home for a few hours of fitful sleep, when he received an email notification on his phone. It was from a listserv he subscribed to, notifications about legal seminars and educational opportunities. The subject line read, "Understanding Trauma and Animal-Assisted Therapy, New Approaches to Legal Strategy presented by Dr." Almost deleted it. He had no time for seminars, but something made him pause. He clicked on the email and read the description. Doctor was a recognized expert in canine behavioral therapy and trauma recovery. She worked with law enforcement agencies, medical institutions, and according to her bio, had recently consulted with a criminal defense attorney on an innovative approach to demonstrating character and emotional stability in legal proceedings. Read the description twice. His exhausted mind was beginning to form an idea, something so unusual and unconventional that it bordered on desperate. But desperation was all he had left. He made a decision. He would attend this seminar, even though it meant driving across town at 6 in the morning and taking time away from his case preparation. Something about this felt important, felt like it might be the breakthrough he desperately needed. The seminar was held at the Metropolitan Convention Center. There were perhaps 24 people in attendance: lawyers, law enforcement officers, mental health professionals, and animal behaviorists. Doctor was a woman in her mid-50s with intelligent eyes and gray-streaked hair. She was warm and articulate, clearly passionate about her work. She spoke about how trauma could be addressed through carefully structured interactions with trained animals. She discussed the neurological basis for how animal interaction could help people overcome fear responses. She presented case studies of individuals who'd experienced severe trauma and had found healing through sessions with trained therapy dogs. During the break, approached her directly. He introduced himself and briefly explained Sarah's situation, without revealing confidential details, of course. He described Emma, a 3-year-old girl traumatized by witnessing her mother's near-fatal accident, now showing signs of PTSD, terrified of authority figures and loud noises, having regressed in her speech and social development. Doctor listened intently. When finished, she was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Then she said something that would change everything. If Emma could overcome her fear through a structured interaction with a trained dog, it would demonstrate several important things. It would show her emotional resilience and her mother's ability to provide support. It would demonstrate that she has a secure, nurturing bond with her caregiver. It would show emotional intelligence and maternal attunement. In a courtroom context, it could be extraordinarily powerful testimony, non-verbal testimony, but testimony nonetheless. His heart began to race. Would such an interaction be admissible in court? It depends on the judge, Doctor said carefully. It wouldn't be direct legal testimony. The child couldn't testify, obviously, but it would be performance-based evidence of emotional stability and maternal bonding. Some judges might consider it character evidence. It would be unconventional, certainly, but not without precedent. Over the next hour, and Doctor discussed possibilities. They talked about what such an interaction might look like, how it could be structured, what safeguards would be necessary. Doctor mentioned that she worked with several law enforcement agencies that had trained therapy dogs. She knew Officer James, a K-9 handler with the police department, whose German Shepherd, Duke, was trained in therapeutic work with trauma victims. Left the seminar with a plan forming in his mind. It was audacious, perhaps even reckless. The prosecution would certainly object. Judge might reject it entirely. But it was the only chance he had left. Emma's simple, unguarded emotional response to an animal and to her mother would speak truths that no lawyer's argument could convey. If Emma could overcome her fear and demonstrate love for her mother, the jury would see what the evidence of her physical injuries and medical care already showed. A mother who loved her child, who was protective of her child, who was not reckless or negligent. That afternoon met with Sarah. He explained the idea carefully, watching her face for signs of hope or skepticism. At first, she seemed uncertain. Emma was terrified of dogs, she said. How could this possibly help? But as explained the theory, how Emma's fear might be overcome in a controlled environment, how her actions and words might move the jury, Sarah began to understand. She began to hope. "What's the risk?" she asked. "The prosecution will fight it," admitted. "They'll argue it's manipulation or coaching. The judge might reject it entirely. If it goes wrong, if Emma becomes more traumatized, it could hurt our case. But if it works," he trailed off, letting Sarah imagine the possibilities. "Let's do it," Sarah said immediately. "We have nothing to lose." That evening called Officer James. He explained his idea and asked if Duke's therapy dog might be available for an unconventional courtroom demonstration. He emphasized that it would be a long shot, that the judge might not even allow it. But a compassionate man with 20 years of law enforcement experience was moved by the story. He'd met Sarah during the investigation and had always felt uncertain about the narrative that had been constructed against her. "I'll talk to the judge," said. "No promises, but I'll try." The next morning, submitted his formal request to judge. He presented it carefully, explaining the therapeutic basis for the interaction, framing it as character evidence, emphasizing Emma's specific trauma and potential for recovery. The prosecution's objections were immediate and vociferous. Richard Caldwell argued that it was manipulative, that it had no legal basis, that it would prejudice the jury. The judge listened to both sides with her characteristic impassivity. For 5 agonizing minutes, Judge said nothing. Then she made her ruling. "I'm going to allow it. One brief, supervised interaction before closing arguments. It's unconventional, but this entire case has been unconventional, and I've seen nothing yet that definitively proves guilt. Let's see what this child can tell us without words." Felt his chest tighten with something between hope and terror. He'd gambled everything on this unconventional strategy. If it worked, Sarah might be acquitted. If it failed, her conviction was virtually guaranteed. There was no going back now. The morning of the interaction arrived with a strange quality of anticipation that permeated the courthouse. News of the unusual courtroom proceeding had leaked somehow, though suspected it was Richard Caldwell's team, hoping that advance publicity might prejudice the judge against allowing it, and media trucks lined the streets outside the building. Reporters stood with microphones and speculating wildly about what was about to happen. One news anchor breathlessly reported that the defense was planning to introduce a dog as evidence, which made the entire proceeding sound absurd and desperate to anyone watching at home. Judge had issued a strict order. The courtroom would be cleared of all media and spectators except for those directly involved in the legal proceedings. The jury would be present. The judge, the attorneys, the court clerk, and a few key witnesses would remain. But no reporters, no curious onlookers, no members of the general public. The courthouse had become tense with anticipation, courthouse employees and other attorneys speculating about what would happen. Some thought it was a brilliant move. Others thought it was a desperation play that would backfire catastrophically. Emma Mitchell woke that morning in her grandmother's bed. She'd been sleeping with almost every night since the accident, terrified to sleep alone. She wore pale pink pajamas with images of butterflies scattered across them. Her small body was curled up against her grandmother's side, one hand clutching Mr. Wiggles, her worn stuffed bunny. Emma's hair was tangled from sleep, and her face bore the peaceful expression of a child in deep slumber. Had arranged her arm carefully around Emma, trying not to wake her, wanting these final moments of sleep before the day's ordeal began. Hadn't slept much that night. She'd been awake since 4 a.m., her mind racing with anxiety about what was about to happen. If the interaction with the dog went wrong, if Emma became more traumatized, the jury might view it as evidence of poor parenting or instability. But if they didn't try, Sarah was going to prison. Kept coming back to the same conclusion. They had to try. They had nothing to lose that they hadn't already lost. At 7:30 a.m., gently woke Emma. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said softly, brushing the tangled hair back from Emma's forehead. "Remember what we talked about?" Emma nodded sleepily. Over the past 2 days, and Johnson had carefully prepared Emma for what was about to happen. They'd used gentle language, age-appropriate explanations. Emma would go to a special place, a big building where grown-ups make important decisions. There would be a nice doggy there, a big doggy named Duke who was very gentle and very kind. Emma's mommy would be there too, and Emma's job was just to be herself, to do whatever felt right in her heart. Had emphasized to that the interaction had to be completely genuine. If Emma was coached or pressured, the jury would sense it. Children, he'd explained, were remarkable in their ability to convey authentic emotion. Emma's natural, unguarded responses would be far more powerful than any coached performance could ever be. Emma ate breakfast, her favorite cereal with banana slices, though she barely tasted it, had dressed her carefully in the outfit they'd chosen together, a pale lavender dress with white trim, white socks with small embroidered ducks, and her favorite yellow hair bow. Emma looked like an angel, thought, which made her heart ache. This innocent child shouldn't have to participate in legal proceedings. No child should ever have to do this. At 8:45 a.m. they arrived at the courthouse. Johnson was waiting in a small conference room. He looked nervous, his tie askew, his hair not quite combed properly. He hadn't shaved that morning, dark stubble shadowing his jaw. He knelt down to Emma's level and spoke to her gently. "Hi, Emma, remember me. I'm going to help your mommy today." Emma nodded, her thumb finding its way into her mouth, a regression in her behavior that had occurred several times over the past months during moments of anxiety. "In a little while, we're going to go into a big room," continued. "There are going to be some grown-ups in there, and your mommy's going to be there. And there's going to be a very special doggy. His name is Duke. Duke is a really good boy, and he loves helping people feel better. Does that sound okay?" Emma looked uncertain, but she nodded. At 9:15 a.m., the participants were ushered into the courtroom. The space felt enormous to 3-year-old Emma. The high ceilings, the wooden paneling, the dark leather chairs, everything was oversized and intimidating. The jury sat in their boxes, their faces carefully neutral. Judge sat elevated at her bench, looking authoritative and stern. Sarah sat at the defense table, her face pale, her hands trembling visibly. She looked at Emma with desperate longing. Richard Caldwell sat at the prosecution table, his expression skeptical and slightly contemptuous. He'd filed a last-minute motion to prevent the interaction, and when Judge had overruled him, he'd made his displeasure known. He believed this entire proceeding was a publicity stunt, a manipulation designed to sway the jury's emotions rather than address the evidence. He was ready to object to anything he perceived as inappropriate influence on the child. Officer James stood at the rear of the courtroom, Duke's leash held firmly in his hand. Duke was a large German shepherd, perhaps 85 pounds of muscle and fur. He was 6 years old, well-trained, and had been specifically bred and selected for work in law enforcement and therapeutic roles. His coat was a rich tan and black, and his dark eyes were intelligent and kind. But to Emma, at this moment, he looked enormous and terrifying. Judge spoke in a gentle voice, unusual for her formal demeanor. "We're going to allow Ms. Emma Mitchell to interact with Officer's dog, Duke, in a controlled manner. Mr. Johnson, you may proceed." Placed a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. "Emma, I want you to stay right here with me. Officer and Duke are going to come closer to us, but nobody's going to make you do anything you don't want to do. You're safe. Your mommy's right over there and she's watching." Officer moved forward slowly, Duke walking beside him. The dog's leash was loose, his pace measured and deliberate. Emma immediately tensed, her small body stiffening. Her hand found Mr. Wiggles, gripping the bunny so tightly that the stuffed animal's head was nearly compressed. Emma's eyes were wide, her breathing shallow. She wanted to run, every instinct in her 3-year-old body screaming at her to flee from this large, unpredictable animal. "It's okay," Officer said softly, his voice calm and reassuring. "Duke's going to lie down now. He's very tired and just wants to rest." Duke responded to a subtle hand signal from lowering himself onto the courtroom floor. The dog's massive body stretched out, his head resting on his paws, his eyes tracking Emma with gentle interest. By lying down, Duke had made himself smaller, less threatening, positioning himself at a level closer to Emma's height. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Everyone, jurors, lawyers, judge, court personnel, held their breath. This was the moment that would define the trial. This was where justice would either prevail or be crushed beneath the weight of corporate power and money. Emma didn't move. 30 seconds passed, then 60. Remained beside her, his hand on her shoulder, offering silent support but no pressure. Sarah sat at her table, tears streaming silently down her face. Sitting in the small gallery area, clasped her hands so tightly that her knuckles turned white. 2 minutes passed. 3. Emma's breathing remained shallow, her body rigid. Officer didn't move. Duke didn't move. Didn't move. The courtroom held its collective breath, waiting to see if this desperate gamble would collapse into failure. Then something shifted. Emma's shoulders relaxed slightly. Her grip on Mr. Wiggles loosened just a fraction. Her eyes, still wide with fear, began to show something else: curiosity, wonder, a spark of courage beginning to kindle in her small heart. Emma took one step forward. Then another. Her entire body was trembling, but she was moving toward the dog, toward her fear, toward something that required a courage that most adults would never have to summon. She was 3 years old, and she was choosing bravery. Emma took another trembling step forward. Her small legs moved as if they belonged to someone else, as if her brave heart was controlling her body against the screaming protests of her traumatized nervous system. She was perhaps 4 feet away from Duke now. Officer remained perfectly still, understanding the delicate choreography of this moment. Any sudden movement, any attempt to guide or encourage, might shatter Emma's fragile determination. Held her breath so completely that she felt dizzy. Her hands remained clasped together, her fingernails digging into her own palms. Beside her, Johnson sat with his eyes closed, his lips moving silently in what might have been prayer. Sarah had stopped crying. She sat rigidly in her chair, her eyes locked on her daughter with an intensity that seemed almost physical in its force. The jury members watched Emma's approach with visible emotion. One woman in the front row had her hand over her mouth. A man in the back row leaned forward, his skeptical expression softening. These were ordinary people: a nurse, a retired teacher, a construction worker, an accountant, a young mother not much older than Sarah herself. They were people who understood fear. They were people who understood courage. And they were watching a 3-year-old child summon both. Emma took another step, and another, 3 feet away from Duke now, 2.5 feet. She could see the details of the dog's face, his dark, intelligent eyes, his black nose, the slight rise and fall of his breathing. Duke had not moved. The dog remained in his resting position, lying flat on the courtroom floor, his massive body patient and still. It was a testament to Duke's training and temperament that he could remain so utterly composed with a terrified child approaching him. Emma's thumb was still in her mouth. Her other hand still gripped Mr. Wiggles, but her eyes had changed. The pure terror had been joined by something else: curiosity, wonder, and a profound determination that seemed far too large for such a small body to contain. She was 2 feet away now. 1 foot. Emma stopped. She stared at Duke, and Duke stared back at Emma. It was a moment suspended in time, a moment that seemed to contain the entire weight of Sarah's trial, the entire injustice of the legal system, the entire question of whether truth and love could prevail against power and money. Then Emma reached out her tiny hand. Her arm extended toward Duke's head, her small fingers trembling visibly. She was shaking so badly that Richard Caldwell briefly wondered if she might faint. But she didn't faint. She moved forward with her hand extended, moving toward that which frightened her most, choosing connection over fear. Her fingers touched Duke's head. The dog's fur was soft, warm and real beneath her touch. Emma's entire body seemed to register this sensation. Her shoulders dropped. Her breathing deepened. Her free hand gradually opened, allowing Mr. Wiggles to rest more naturally in her lap rather than being gripped in a stranglehold. Emma stroked Duke's head gently, her small fingers moving through his fur in hesitant, tender movements. She continued stroking, her fear gradually transforming into something that looked remarkably like peace. Officer's eyes glistened with tears. Judge blinked rapidly, her judicial composure momentarily cracking. Several jurors were openly weeping. This was the moment that Doctor had predicted. This was the moment where a child's authentic emotional response transcended the limitations of the legal system and spoke to something deeper, something about love, protection, safety, and the bond between a mother and her child. Emma's interaction with Duke demonstrated that she was capable of overcoming terror through trust. It demonstrated that she possessed emotional resilience. It demonstrated that somewhere in her traumatized psyche, there remained the capacity for wonder and connection. And it demonstrated, without any doubt, that she had a secure, nurturing bond with a caregiver who had taught her that it was safe to be brave. Emma continued stroking Duke's head. After perhaps 30 seconds, Johnson spoke softly. "Emma, thank you for being so brave. I want you to look over at your mommy for a moment." Emma's head turned. She looked across the courtroom towards Sarah sitting at the defense table. Sarah's face was streaked with tears, her entire body trembling with emotion. For a moment, mother and daughter locked eyes. The love between them was so palpable, so undeniable, that it seemed to fill the entire courtroom like a physical presence. Emma turned back to Duke. She patted his head gently and whispered something so quietly that most people in the courtroom couldn't hear it. Officer heard it. Johnson heard it. The courtroom stenographer leaning forward heard it. And it was those words, those two simple words whispered by a 3-year-old child in the presence of a gentle dog, that would change everything. Emma said, "Good boy." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence of the courtroom, those words rang out with crystalline clarity. They were the words of a child who had learned to find comfort in goodness, to recognize kindness, to reach out with love even when her world had been shattered by trauma. They were the words of a child whose mother had taught her to see the good in others, to be brave, to connect despite fear. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath collectively. Judge's expression had changed completely. The stern judicial demeanor had been replaced by something more human, more vulnerable. Tears were visible on her cheeks. Emma reached out again and continued petting Duke, her small hand moving gently across his head and ears. Then she looked back at her mother. She held Sarah's gaze for several long seconds. And then, in a voice slightly louder than before, Emma said 3 words that would become the centerpiece of legal arguments and news stories for years to come. "Mama safe." The courtroom erupted. Sarah made a sound, something between a sob and a cry of anguish and relief. She stood up from her chair, her lawyer grabbing her arm to steady her, let out a sound that was almost a wail of release. Several jurors were openly crying now, no longer attempting to hide their emotions. One woman in the jury box held a tissue to her face. A man in the back wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Richard Caldwell remained absolutely still, his face draining of color. He understood in that moment that his case had just been irrevocably damaged. No amount of expert testimony, no amount of technical evidence could erase what the jury had just witnessed. Emma had not been coached. Emma had not been manipulated. Emma had simply been herself, a traumatized but courageous child expressing the fundamental truth of her relationship with her mother. Judge called for order, but her voice lacked its usual stern authority. She looked at Officer and nodded slightly. "Officer, thank you. You may return to the gallery." Officer stood, Duke standing with him, both man and dog having performed their extraordinary role in this unprecedented courtroom moment. As they walked back, Officer paused for just a moment beside Sarah's table. He looked at her with compassion and gave her the slightest nod of acknowledgement. The court stenographer had been recording everything. The transcript would show Emma's words, though the transcript could never capture the trembling vulnerability of her voice, the physical courage it had taken to speak them, or the profound emotional resonance they'd created in the courtroom. Johnson remained standing, his hand on Sarah's shoulder. He could feel his client trembling, could feel the release of months of terror and hopelessness that seemed to be flowing through Sarah's body. He looked at the jury, seeing the transformation that had occurred in their faces. The skepticism was gone. The doubt had been replaced by something that looked like clarity, like certainty. Emma continued petting Duke, unaware of the monumental impact her actions and words had created. She was simply being a child, a brave, traumatized child who had summoned courage beyond her years and had spoken a truth that no legal argument could match. The 2 words "good boy" and the 3 words "mama safe" had just changed everything. The prosecution's final arguments began that afternoon, but the momentum had fundamentally shifted. Richard Caldwell stood before the jury with the confidence he'd maintained throughout the trial, but something essential had changed in the jurors' eyes. They were no longer listening with the same absorption they had shown to his expert witnesses. They were no longer nodding at his technical explanations. Instead, they kept glancing toward the empty space where Emma had stood with Duke, as if the ghost of that courageous interaction lingered in the courtroom air. Caldwell attempted to regain control of the narrative. He argued with professional polish that the interaction with the dog had been orchestrated manipulation, designed to exploit the jury's emotions rather than address the actual evidence. He suggested that Emma's words had been coached, rehearsed, prepared in advance. He questioned the appropriateness of allowing a child to participate in courtroom proceedings, implying that it was an abuse of the judicial process. He reminded the jury of their oath to decide the case based on evidence, not on emotional reactions to a dog interaction. His words fell on deaf ears. The jury wasn't rejecting his legal arguments outright, but they were hearing them through the lens of what they'd witnessed that morning. They'd seen a terrified child overcome her fear. They'd seen genuine, unguarded emotion. They'd heard 2 simple phrases that carried absolute authenticity. No jury consultant could have coached a 3-year-old to fake that level of emotional genuineness. No lawyer could have manufactured that particular quality of truth. Judge had allowed both sides to file supplemental briefs before jury instructions. The prosecution's brief was aggressive, arguing that the dog interaction was highly prejudicial and fundamentally inappropriate for legal proceedings. The defense's brief was more measured, framing the interaction as character evidence demonstrating Sarah's parenting capabilities and Emma's emotional stability despite trauma. But Judge's jury instructions, delivered the next morning, seemed to subtly validate the unconventional evidence. While she instructed the jury to base their verdict on the evidence presented, testimony, documents, expert analysis, she also noted that evidence of a defendant's character and reputation is admissible and may be considered in evaluating the overall credibility and responsibility of the defendant. She didn't specifically reference Emma's interaction with Duke, but the implication was clear. What they had witnessed was legally relevant. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 17 minutes. Waiting for a jury verdict is one of the most agonizing experiences known to the legal system. Sarah sat in the courthouse hallway with Johnson on one side and her mother on the other. Emma was with a court-appointed provider in a separate room, mercifully unaware of the tension consuming the adults. They didn't speak much. What was there to say? Everything had been said. Everything had been done that could be done. Now they simply had to wait. At 4:32 p.m. the clerk's office called. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly. The prosecution's team entered with grim expressions. Officer was present in the gallery, Duke at home with a family member. The judge took her seat. The jury entered, their expressions unreadable, Trained lawyers and experienced jurors know that verdict expressions are carefully controlled, revealing nothing of the jury's decision. The judge asked the critical question, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The jury foreman, a woman named Barbara Martinez who worked as a nurse, stood. "We have, Your Honor." On the charge of reckless endangerment, how do you find the defendant, Sarah Mitchell? The words seemed to hang in the air for an eternity, though it was probably only a few seconds. Then Barbara Martinez spoke. "Not guilty." The courtroom erupted. Sarah collapsed against her mother, her body racked with sobs. Johnson closed his eyes and released a breath he seemed to have been holding for months, made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a cry. On the charge of criminal negligence causing serious bodily injury, how do you find the defendant? "Not guilty," Barbara Martinez said again. The courtroom erupted again, louder this time. Sarah stood up and pulled her into an embrace. For months she had carried the weight of this legal nightmare. For months she had faced the possibility of prison, of losing her daughter, of having her life destroyed by corporate power and legal manipulation. And now, in 2 words, not guilty, it was over. Judge called for order and thanked the jury for their service. She allowed the jury to leave before addressing the courtroom. This case has demonstrated the importance of listening to all voices, particularly the smallest and most innocent ones. We may not always be able to articulate truth in legal terminology, but truth persists regardless of the language we use to describe it. Justice has prevailed today. Over the following weeks, however, an even more important truth emerged. As part of the post-trial discovery process, Johnson's office obtained additional documentation regarding the truck's maintenance. Working with an independent investigator, they uncovered evidence of deliberate fraud. The maintenance records that Caldwell's team had presented as evidence of proper brake service were fabricated. The garage owner, Tommy, admitted under pressure from law enforcement that he'd been paid $8,000 by Caldwell's law firm to sign false documents. The actual brake service performed on the truck had been cursory. The brakes had not been properly inspected, and the brake fluid had not been topped off despite being critically low. But the fraud went deeper than mere document falsification. Internal emails from Superior Logistics revealed that the company had known about systematic brake problems in their fleet for months. A maintenance supervisor had flagged the issue in March, warning that several trucks had experienced brake failures or near failures. Management had responded by classifying the emails as confidential and instructing maintenance staff not to discuss the issue with drivers or regulators. They'd calculated that paying occasional accident settlements would be cheaper than systematically replacing brakes across their entire fleet. The truck that had hit Sarah's car had been flagged for brake inspection 6 times in the 18 months before the accident. 6 times. It had never received a thorough inspection. It had simply continued operating with failing brakes, driven by, who had never been told there was a problem, across hundreds of miles of public roads. The revelations shocked the legal community and the public. The state attorney general's office announced criminal charges against Superior Logistics, its CEO, and 3 senior managers for fraud, conspiracy, and endangering public safety. Richard Caldwell's law firm was investigated for its role in fabricating evidence. Caldwell himself faced potential disbarment proceedings. The truck driver was interviewed again. He was devastated to learn that his truck's brakes had been known to be faulty, that he'd been knowingly driving a dangerous vehicle. He cooperated fully with authorities and agreed to testify against his former employer. The civil lawsuits against Superior Logistics. By the end, the company had settled for $27 million to resolve various claims and agreed to implement systematic safety improvements across their entire fleet. Sarah stood in a press conference, her arm still in its brace, but her face transformed by relief and vindication. Beside her stood Johnson, Officer James with Duke and Doctor. Behind her stood her mother and her daughter Emma, who still didn't fully understand the magnitude of what had transpired, but who understood that her mother was no longer afraid. "Justice," Sarah said into the microphone, her voice steady despite her emotional turmoil, "doesn't always come quickly. It doesn't always come easily. And it doesn't always arrive through the traditional channels we expect. But I've learned that truth persists. Goodness persists. And sometimes the smallest voices, the most innocent voices, can speak with more power than any expert testimony ever could." She looked down at Emma, who stood beside her holding Mr. Wiggles. "My daughter," Sarah continued, "taught me that courage means moving forward even when you're terrified. She taught me that goodness exists even in the midst of trauma. And she taught me that sometimes the most profound truths can be expressed in just a few words." The media frenzy that followed was intense. News outlets across the country picked up the story of the 3-year-old girl whose 2 words had changed the course of justice. True crime podcasts began investigating the broader story of corporate negligence and legal fraud. Legal scholars wrote articles analyzing the unprecedented use of animal-assisted therapy as courtroom evidence. The case became a template for future proceedings involving traumatized witnesses. But for Sarah and Emma, the most important outcome was simply that they got their lives back. 6 months after the not guilty verdict, Sarah stood in front of her advanced placement literature class at Lincoln High School. She was wearing a soft blue blouse, and her left arm, no longer in a brace, was raised as she gestured toward a passage from "To Kill a Mockingbird" displayed on the screen behind her. Her students watched her intently, engaged and attentive. Some of them had followed the trial through media coverage, though they'd never explicitly discussed it in class. Sarah had decided that her students would learn about the case when she was ready to teach it, when her own wounds had healed enough that the experience could become a lesson rather than a trauma. "Finch says that simply because we fail doesn't mean we shouldn't try," Sarah explained, her voice steady and clear. "Justice doesn't always come easily. It doesn't always come quickly. But the attempt to seek it is what defines us as human beings." She paused, looking at the face of a student in the front row, a young man named who had been struggling with anxiety about his own future. She'd encouraged him to consider law school, to become someone who fought for justice. She understood now, in a way she never could have before the trial, what true courage looked like. She'd learned it from a 3-year-old girl with a stuffed bunny. That evening, Sarah arrived at her mother's house to pick up Emma, had continued providing while Sarah returned to work, though they'd made arrangements for Emma to attend preschool part-time. Emma's anxiety had gradually diminished over the past months, and her speech had returned to its previously advanced level. The trauma was still there. It would likely remain with her in some form throughout her life, but it was no longer the defining characteristic of her days. Emma ran to the door when she heard the car, bursting through it with the uninhibited joy that children possess. "Mommy," she called, her voice bright and clear. She threw her arms around Sarah's legs, and Sarah lifted her up, spinning her gently. The physical affection between them had deepened since the trial, both of them acutely aware of how close they'd come to being separated by the legal system. "Hi, sweetheart," Sarah said, kissing the top of Emma's head. "How was your day?" "Good," Emma said enthusiastically. "We learned about butterflies today, and Miss said butterflies start as caterpillars and they change into something beautiful, like how you were sad and now you're happy." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Children had a remarkable way of articulating profound truths in simple language. Emma was right. Sarah had transformed like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. The trauma had changed her, shaped her, but it had also made her stronger, more compassionate, more aware of her own capacity for resilience. That Saturday, Sarah and Emma met Officer James and Duke at Riverside Park. It had become a weekly ritual over the past months. Emma had moved from her terror of dogs to genuine affection for Duke specifically, and through him, to dogs in general. She would spend hours throwing balls for Duke to fetch, laughing with uninhibited joy as the massive dog would bound through the grass with the ball in his mouth. Officer became a steady presence in their lives, someone Emma trusted completely. He represented safety and goodness, and the weekly visits provided both comfort and evidence that the world contained both danger and protection. "She's doing remarkably well," Officer observed to Sarah as they watched Emma play. Duke was lying beside Emma, allowing her to braid his ears with colorful ribbons while the dog remained patient and gentle. "She is," Sarah agreed. "Some days I can see the trauma still affecting her, loud noises, sudden movements, authority figures in uniforms other than you. But overall, she's healing. We're both healing." Officer nodded. "You know, Duke's been nominated for a formal service award because of his role in your trial. The department wants to recognize the work he did." Sarah smiled. "That's wonderful. He deserves it. He was more helpful than any expert witness could have been." A few weeks later, Sarah received a call from Dr. The canine behavioral specialist had become a close advisor and friend during the trial process. She was calling to invite Sarah to participate in a groundbreaking symposium on animal-assisted therapy and its applications in legal proceedings. The symposium would bring together lawyers, psychologists, animal behaviorists, and judges to explore how animals could be utilized in courtrooms in appropriate ethical ways. Sarah was being asked to speak about her experience, to tell her story from a mother's perspective. Sarah accepted immediately. She saw the opportunity as a chance to transform her trauma into something meaningful, to help other families who might find themselves trapped in similar nightmares. She began working on her presentation, crafting her narrative for public consumption. It was difficult work, emotionally draining, but it felt necessary. If her suffering could have purpose, if her story could help change the justice system to be more compassionate and creative in its approach to trauma, then something good could come from everything she'd endured. Emma, now 4 years old, had begun showing artistic talent. She loved to draw and paint, and her artwork had become a window into her emotional processing. She created images of butterflies, flowers, and dogs, lots and lots of dogs. One painting in particular captivated Sarah. It showed 2 figures, one large and one small, holding hands. The large figure was purple, the small figure was yellow. Between them was a large orange dog with a smile. Beneath the painting, with help from a teacher, Emma had written the words, "Me and Mommy and Duke, we are a team." Sarah framed that painting and hung it in her office at school. 9 months after the trial, Sarah completed a book manuscript about her experience, titled "The Smallest Voices: How a Child's Courage Changed Everything." It detailed her journey from the accident through the trial, but more importantly, it explored themes of justice, resilience, and the power of unconventional thinking. She worked with a literary agent and eventually signed a publishing deal. The book would be released the following year, and early reviews from advanced readers were overwhelmingly positive. One reviewer called it a profound meditation on justice, motherhood, and the human capacity for courage in the face of systemic injustice. Sarah established a scholarship fund for underfunded public defenders, providing financial assistance to pay for expert witnesses and investigators. She named it the Emma Mitchell Fund for Justice, a way of honoring her daughter's inadvertent but profound contribution to the cause of truth. The fund's first recipients were already being selected, dedicated public defenders working in cases where the odds seemed impossible. She also became a vocal advocate for criminal justice reform, speaking to legislators about the inequities between well-funded prosecutors and under-resourced defense attorneys. She before a state commission about her experience, about how money had nearly cost her her freedom and her daughter's future. Her testimony was instrumental in securing increased funding for public defender offices in 3 counties. A year after the verdict, Sarah and Emma attended a ceremony where Officer James was formally recognized for his work in innovative courtroom procedures. Emma, now 5 years old, presented with a framed photograph of herself petting Duke in the courtroom, accepted it with tears in his eyes, and Duke seemed to sense the importance of the moment, pressing his body against Emma's side in silent support. That evening, sitting on her back porch with a cup of tea, Sarah reflected on the journey she'd traveled. The accident that had nearly killed her, the trial that had nearly imprisoned her, the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed her, all of it had been transformed into something larger than herself. She wasn't grateful for the trauma, would never be grateful for the suffering she and Emma had endured. But she had learned to extract meaning from it, to use it as fuel for change. Emma was inside watching a movie with Mr. Wiggles tucked under her arm. The stuffed bunny, once a symbol of her pre-trauma innocence, had become a symbol of her resilience. She still carried it everywhere, but now it represented not regression but continuity, a connection to who she had been before, and a talisman for who she was becoming. Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled through photos. Emma on her 5th birthday, surrounded by children who'd been afraid of her after the trial, but who'd slowly come to understand that she was simply a normal kid who'd experienced extraordinary circumstances. Emma in her graduation gown from preschool, beaming with pride. Emma with Officer and Duke at the park, her face radiant with joy. These were the images that mattered. Not the courtroom drama, not the legal maneuvering, not the corporate malfeasance. These images of an ordinary child and an ordinary mother who had survived the extraordinary and emerged stronger. As the sun set over Riverside, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Emma's favorite colors, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years: true peace. Not the absence of pain or trauma, but the presence of hope. Not the erasure of what had happened, but the transformation of it into something meaningful. Sarah and Emma had survived. They'd more than survived, they'd thrived. They'd learned that the smallest voices could speak the loudest truths. They'd learned that courage could be found in the most unexpected places. And they'd learned that love, authentic and unconditional, was the most powerful force in the universe, more powerful than corporate money, more powerful than expert testimony, more powerful than any legal system designed by human hands. Their journey had been a nightmare, but it had also been a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the power of truth, and the extraordinary courage of a 3-year-old girl who'd looked at her fear and chosen bravery. And they would live with that knowledge for the rest of their lives.